Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to another edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of the Fair Housing and Commercial Property Division for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Have you ever wondered why we chose this title for our program? It's because we want to convey that as a leading civil rights enforcement agency, we have a collaborative voice that speaks through our staff, our housing advocate partners, that do some of the preemptive heavy lifting on the policy front, through our enforcement efforts, most certainly, and through the voices of those most vulnerable to the impact of discrimination in a housing-related transaction. Lastly, PHRC speaks through the regulatory actions that they are empowered to take under the PHRA. Now, that leaves just the second portion of the title of the program, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. As you can imagine, much has changed since the enactment of the Fair Housing Law in this country. The federal statute was amended to include disability and familial status in 1988. That's just 35 years ago. What that means is that if those protected classes would not have been added, individuals with disabilities and families with children under the age of 18 could still be denied housing today. That is why it's important to speak about fair housing in the 21st century, to ensure that we as a Commonwealth can live up to the promise of fair housing for all. In the spirit of continuing to ensure fair housing for all and how the PHRC is ensuring this across the Commonwealth, we've invited our guest today, which is Joe Bolstein. He was appointed to serve as interim chair of the PHRC in 2016 and named chair in 2018. He's currently a partner in the law firm of Fox Rothschild LLP, where his practice consists of environmental law and governmental affairs. His environmental practice focuses on brownfields redevelopment and the reuse of old industrial sites. Bolstein assists developers, including home builders, with environmental-related construction issues, including permit procurement, erosion and sediment controls, and environmental assessments and remediation. He also advises clients on permit and enforcement actions and regulatory compliance. He also represents buyers, sellers, lenders, and public entities in corporate and real estate transactions. Bolstein, he's got a great resume, but we've kind of shortened it today. He served 3 terms as the U.S. EPA's National Advisory Council for Environmental Policy and Technology. He was Deputy Secretary for Special Projects at the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. He managed the implementation of Pennsylvania's Land Recycling Act, Act 2 of 1995, and helped write the regulations for the Land Recycling Program. He's also represented the Commonwealth in the Republican Governors Association Task Force on Circular Reform. Welcome to PHRC Speaks. It's great to have you here, Joe.
It's great to be here, Director Garcia.
I want to start like I start every program, every question with every guest. It's talk to me about your social justice journey. What drives your work at PHRC?
What drives my work at PHRC are the people at PHRC who are just incredibly dedicated to the mission that we have at PHRC, which is eliminating, eradicating discrimination in the Commonwealth. I grew up in North Jersey in a middle class area, didn't have a lot of diversity. I spent a lot of time in my career focusing on increasing diversity in the legal profession. So at one point I was an officer in the American Bar Association, and I realized that the senior portion of the American Bar Association didn't have as much diversity as the Young Lawyers Division when I was very active. And I set out in the section that I was a member of, which had 15,000 members, to do everything I could to increase the diversity of our section. when I was deputy secretary at DEP, one of the responsibilities I had was we had 30 different boards and commissions and advisory groups that were part of DEP. So there were maybe 300 folks there, and we had a significant lack of diversity. So I tried to do everything I could to add diversity to those boards and commissions that were underneath DEP. And I think I got the eye of the people in the governor's office because I interacted with their public affairs office. And they said to me, hey, if we have something interesting, this is after I left my government service, would you be interested? And I said, absolutely. And then they called me, 1999, and said there was an opening on the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So I've been a commissioner since 1999, but I didn't know what I was getting into. And I remember showing up for the first meeting and realizing that I was now on a group that the chairperson was Reverend Robert Johnson Smith, who had marched with Dr. King. And Homer Floyd was our executive director, who was an icon of the civil rights movement. And to one side of me was Jerry Mondesire, who was the head of the NAACP. And I, at that moment, I realized that what I was involved with at PHRC was something larger than myself. And that after the years that I've spent on PHRC, you do realize there's a lot of hate in the Commonwealth. We're one of the states that has the most hate groups. We get 3,000 or 4,000 complaints every year of people alleging that they've been discriminated against in employment, in housing, in education, and public accommodations. And you see it when we put on programs. You hear from people and you realize that we're really changing lives at PHRC and that there's so much that we can do. And so that my journey is a little different. What I tell people is I'll never know what it was like to grow up poor. I'll never know what it was like to grow up in a neighborhood that was diverse. But now I'm older. Now I see that there's so many more things that we need to do to improve our society. I come from a family of 22 generations of rabbis, and in Judaism, there's something called tikkun olam, which is to heal the world. And I think what we're doing in PHRC really is along that vein, which is to heal the world, to eliminate discrimination, and eliminate racial tension, and do everything that we can possible to make things fair for everybody.
Excellent. Now, you've been deeply involved in working towards PHRC's regulations. Tell us about these regulations and why they matter to Pennsylvanians.
Okay. Well, I think first you have to start with the fact that the PHRC has authority to enact and implement regulations. We don't do it that often. So in all the years that I've been on PHRC, I think maybe we've had 2 reg packages. This one was important. So what it does is, I'll go back to the beginning. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was one of the few states where LGBTQ was not a protected class. So what does that mean? That means that if you were gay, or if you were lesbian or transgender, you could be fired, and there'd be no protection under the PHRA. No remedy available for that person. For years, there were efforts made in the General Assembly to enact legislation, but it never really went anywhere. So what happened was municipalities across the Commonwealth started enacting their own ordinances that would protect people who are LGBTQ from discrimination. So you had the city of Philadelphia, the city of Pittsburgh, 70 or 80 other jurisdictions that enacted ordinances. So maybe half of the Commonwealth was covered by these ordinances that would protect LGBTQ citizens from discrimination. But the problem there was you could be in Philadelphia protected, move across the road into somewhere in Bucks or Montgomery County in a municipality that didn't have an ordinance, and you could be discriminated against without any remedy. So we decided at PHRC back in 2016 that we needed to do something. And what we did was we put a guidance document in place. So we have the authority under Section 7 of the PHRA to enact policies and regulations that effectuate the act. And so we put out a guidance that said we would receive complaints from people who are LGBTQ who are alleging discrimination on the grounds that it was sex stereotyping. And one of the protected classes under the statute is sex. So we received about 8,000 public comments on that guidance document. It was a lot to wade through, but eventually we finalized it in 2018. Subsequent to that, and the interesting thing was after we finalized the LGBTQ guidance, we didn't really hear much from the people who opposed it. But in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court was faced with a case called Bolstein. The Bolstein case involved 3 people who were fired because of their sexual orientation, or gender identity, or they were transgender. In fact, the named plaintiff in the case, Gerald Bostock, was, I believe, a county employee in Georgia. He had joined a gay men's softball league. And when his bosses found out, he was fired. There was another person who was a skydiving instructor, I believe, in New York, who was fired when their boss found out that they were gay. And then there was a transgender employee who was fired when they said they were going on vacation, and when they were going to come back, they were self-identifying as female, and they were fired. The Supreme Court wrote a decision, 6-3. It was written by Neil Gorsuch, who was a conservative member of the court. And basically what Justice Gorsuch said was that there is a protected class, sex, in the Civil Rights Act. And when those people were discriminated against, it was on the basis of sex. You couldn't deny that fact because they were fired because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or that they were transgender. So after that case came out, PHRC decided that we wanted to make our guidance to have the same force of law, okay? Because the guidance doesn't have the force of law, it's just a policy. Regulations, on the other hand, become law. So we put together a regulatory package, and that regulation says that we would define the protected class sex, which is in the PHRA, as including not just sex at birth, but also sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, and transgender. There's a whole long list of categories that now are covered as sex-based discrimination. We also included additional definitions for the term religious creed, and also for, there was one other thing, and for race. So race, we said that hairstyles now were also indicative of race, and that if somebody was discriminated against on the basis of their hairstyle, that could also be considered discriminatory. So we put those regulations out for public comment because that's what you have to do in the Commonwealth. We received a lot of comments, and they were very thoughtful comments. We went through all of them. We made some revisions to the regulatory package. And then in December, we presented those regulations to the Independent Regulatory Review Commission, and they voted 3-2 in support of the regulatory package. So our expectation is that those will become fully effective in a month or two. There's a delay because the General Assembly hasn't technically come back into session for 14 days. But as soon as they do, the IRC will send that reg package to be published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, and then they'll be final. So I'm very proud of it.
Yeah.
It took a lot of work on the part of our staff, who did an amazing job. And so now our LGBTQ friends and neighbors, our colleagues, our children are all protected from discrimination in the Commonwealth.
And that's what I wanted to talk about. And I mean, this is such a historic endeavor, and you ought to be congratulated along with the rest of the members of the staff and commissioners that worked alongside with you to get that done. Now, in conversations in the past, you've talked about why you are personally passionate about ensuring the rights for Pennsylvanians of all sexual orientations and gender identity. Can you talk about how this issue impacts you personally?
Sure. So I recently attended a same-sex wedding, and I was the father of one of the two brides. My daughter, Rebecca, she grew up in Doylestown, Bucks County. She was born in Montgomery County, went to college in Lancaster County. When she was in college, came to me and said that she wanted to talk to me and about something that was important to her. So I went to see her at school. We went out. We sat down to have dinner, and she looked at me and she said, "How would you feel if I told you that I was gay?" And I thought for a second, and I said, "Well, Becca, I'm the last person on earth who's going to judge you. All I really need to know is that this makes you happy." And she said, "Yeah, I'm very happy." And so it's personal to me because I saw what my daughter went through and what her friends went through in terms of discrimination, the fear of coming out, and to me, I don't understand why anybody would be discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation. It makes no sense to me at all. And in listening, what's funny is when you're the parent of a child that's LGBTQ, whenever you have conversations, just even small talk with people at different gatherings, you start to realize that there are a lot of people who are in your shoes. So in my office, there's a lawyer 2 doors down from me whose daughter is gay. There's another person whose sister was gay and had to leave the state to get married in Vermont. And the one thing that hit me the hardest was after my daughter graduated from college in Lancaster, she said she didn't feel comfortable living in a state that wouldn't protect gay people from discrimination. And she moved to New York, and she's living there now, and she's happy in New York. But I thought to myself, we're losing a lot of good people because Pennsylvania is not viewed as a state that's welcoming to people who are LGBTQ. Whenever they score states, they rank states on their protectiveness for LGBTQ. Until we had these regulations in place, we ranked in the middle or the bottom. And I wanted to change that. And there's absolutely no reason why there shouldn't be protection from discrimination for people who are LGBTQ across the Commonwealth. And now that we have these regulations, that's how things will be.
You know, I often say to my granddaughter, I said, "Listen, I would change the world for you, but here you are. You've actually done it."
Yeah,
so
I can tell you, after the vote came in front of the IRC, and I live in Bucks County, so I spent 2 hours driving home from Harrisburg. I had tears in my eyes.
Yeah.
I thought, this is going to really protect so many people in Pennsylvania. And it wasn't just me. I mean, all the commissioners and the staff. We have an incredible staff at PHRC. They're the ones who did all the hard work. We had to put together a regulatory package to send it to the IRC that explained all of the legal regulatory basis for us doing this. So I played a very small role in this. So all of the credit should go to our staff and to all of the people who advocated for this, all of the stakeholders, and this is for them. And I'm proud of the staff. I'm proud of us. And now I know that anybody who's LGBTQ who believes that they're discriminated against in employment, housing, education, public accommodations now can come to PHRC and we can provide them with a remedy.
Absolutely. So you mentioned before that you knew that you had seen your daughter being discriminated. What are some of the examples of housing discrimination that these regulations would protect against?
Okay. Well, I think the simplest one and the easiest one is being denied an apartment on the basis of your sexual orientation or your transgender. Before we even put the guidance document in place, we had a case in front of PHRC, and I remember it very distinctly, where a young man saw an advertisement for a one-bedroom apartment, and he called the apartment manager on the ad, and he said, "I'd like to come see the apartment." And she said, "That's great. I'd like to get some information." She said, "Okay, is anybody else going to be living in this apartment with you?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Who?" And he gave the name of another man. And she said, "Well, you do realize this is a one-bedroom apartment. Where is Mr. So-and-so going to be sleeping?" And he said, "Well, he's going to be sleeping with me because he's my partner." And the apartment manager said, "Oh, well, we can't have that." And then she hung up. And then he was smart enough to get one of his female colleagues in his office to call the same ad and say, "I'm interested in the apartment." And she said, "Anybody else going to be coming?" And she said, "Yes." And she gave the name of another female. And she said, "When can you come and look at the apartment?" Now, at the time, we didn't have the guidance, we didn't have the regulations, and there was no statute. And when I was a commissioner, I said, well, this is the exact fact pattern that proves that there's discrimination against people in housing. Now that wouldn't happen now. Okay. Now that we have these regulations, that person would be able to call us and make a complaint. But I think that's probably the first item, which is nobody will be denied housing on the basis of their status as being LGBTQ. Where it could else come in is, you're transgender. You need to go into a homeless shelter. And now they want to put you in an area of the homeless shelter where you would be with people who were the same sex that you were at birth and not your gender identity. And I think that person would now have a claim that they could make to PHRC. I think the vast majority of cases that are going to come to PHRC based on the LGBTQ regulations are probably going to be in the employment context. But that's the same way it is for most of the cases that come to PHRC. For housing, a lot of the cases now that we get are about support animals, emotional support animals. And that law is evolving. So we see a lot of those cases. But I think what I want to impress upon people now is if you're LGBTQ and you believe that you've been discriminated against in any way in housing, and it could be even in a mortgage application or an appraisal of your property, anything that you believe is on the basis of your status as being LGBTQ, your protected status, you could contact the PHRC, file a complaint, and we would investigate it.
Absolutely. And I have a couple of minutes left, so I want to ask this for you briefly. What are some additional housing barriers that you see in your work with the Commission? And what are some of the steps that can be explored to combat those barriers?
Well, some of them are things that we've looked at before, like predatory lending. Okay, so predatory lending is, when mortgage brokers were encouraging people to come in and get mortgages when maybe they didn't really need them. They wanted to do home improvement projects where they were refinancing. And then these were normally in the secondary mortgage market where people wouldn't qualify for ordinary conventional mortgage financing. And they would impose oppressive terms and interest rates and balloon payments and things like that. And we actually put a guidance in place years ago, 2005. And there were some mortgage lenders that got in a lot of trouble and paid some significant fines and penalties for those kinds of home improvement scams or really oppressive mortgages. I'd say, our goal on housing discrimination is to eradicate housing discrimination. The biggest problem, the biggest concern that I see is the lack of affordable housing.
Yeah.
And the lack of affordable housing affects people not just in their ability to live somewhere and get a place that they can afford, but if there's no affordable housing, that means you have problems in terms of where you're going to go to school, where you're going to get a job, where you're going to get food, basic things, okay,
Sure.
if there's a lack of affordable housing. The question for us is, and what PHRC will need to look into deeply is, why is there a lack of affordable housing, and is it due to discrimination? If it's due to discrimination like exclusionary zoning, where municipalities don't want to create any areas for affordable housing, then I think that's something that we need to address.
Agreed.
I do a lot of work in the area of residential development, and I've seen situations where somebody proposes affordable housing, and the next thing you know, the community comes out in opposition to it. And the folks who are the supervisors in that municipality, they bend to the will of the people who speak the loudest.
Right.
Okay, whether it's right or wrong. And I think that that's unfortunate, and I think that's something that that you and I and the other folks at PHRC who deal with housing discrimination can look into. We have a new administration that's just come in. I'm hoping that one of the areas that they would like us to get more involved with is housing discrimination and what we can do to help bring about more affordable housing.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us on PHRC Speaks, and I look forward to working with you to heal the world, as you say.
I can't think of anything that would make me happier.
Thanks again, Joe.
It's great to be with you, Director Garcia.
You bet. I also want to thank you, the viewer, for joining us today. For more information on this topic, or if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in a housing transaction, visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov or give us a call at 717-787-9780. We're also pretty easy to find online if you check out all of our social media platforms. That's going to do it for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.